Hello, I have a term for you that you probably do not use very often. You probably do not hear it very often, but I think you're going to be hearing it a lot in the future. That phrase is evidence-based astrology. Again, something you probably don't hear much about, you don't think much about. It's not a phrase or a buzzword that crosses your mind very often, but I think you're going to be hearing a lot more about it. Let me introduce you to this concept of evidence-based astrology. What is evidence-based astrology? Well, to start off, let me talk first about what we mean by evidence-based, and also that evidence-based practices, such as in medicine, psychology, physical therapy, all kinds of different professional areas, is growing very rapidly. This is a hot area in a lot of professions right now, is the increasing evidence on being evidence-based practices. And we're going to see how these ideas could apply to astrology and that we might want to develop an evidence-based astrology. And I'm going to conclude, a little preview to where we're headed with this. I'm going to conclude that evidence-based astrology is really important. It's totally awesome, very cool, and I think it's the future of astrology. How's that for a big claim? So let's first go over this concept of what evidence-based means, how it's developing in other professions, and how it might relate to what's going on in astrology. Okay, let's take this one step at a time. First thing, what do we mean by evidence-based? Okay, what we mean is, hold on one second here. Okay, got this organized. Evidence-based is exactly what it sounds like. Areas like medicine, psychology, education, physical therapy, etc., employ evidence-based methods to determine how those fields should be practiced, what you do when you have a patient if you're a doctor or a nurse, what you do with your clients if you're in psychology, how you educate your students if you're in the area of education, that they are evidence-based. Well, duh, you might think, what else would medicine be based on in modern times or psychology? Isn't that the whole concept of modern way of thinking, that things are evidence-based? Well, some surprises. Toward the end of the 1980s, a group at Rand Corporation showed that large proportions of procedures performed by physicians were considered inappropriate even by the standards of their own experts. That's a quote from a Wikipedia page on evidence-based medicine. This is pretty interesting. Towards the end of the 1980s, we're not talking about the Middle Ages here. So at the end of the 1980s, Rand Corporation, which is a very well-known, excellent research group, found that large proportions of procedures performed by physicians were considered inappropriate even by their own standards, even by their own experts. Yes. So you go to the doctor's going to do something that may not be supported by research. This is what was found out. And um, this discovery in the 1980s from the Rand Corporation that a lot of medicine is, as it's practiced, is not evidence-based, is one of the research, among others, and findings that have propelled this huge emphasis today on evidence-based medicine, which the evidence-based medicine movement started in the late 60s. The study by the Rand Corporation was just one more solid piece of evidence that an emphasis on evidence-based medicine is really needed. This spread into other fields like psychology and education and became called evidence-based practice. So we have EBM specific to medicine, which is where a lot of this emphasis on evidence-based started, and then it spread into other fields and called EBP, evidence-based practice. And evidence-based practice, to quote from Wikipedia again, is an interdisciplinary approach to clinical practice that has been gaining ground following its formal introduction in 1992. So again, its formal introduction starts becoming a strong concept around which education and practices are based this EBP emphasis formally introduced in 1992. So these are fairly recent. In the last 20 to 30 years, these ideas are being introduced into different professions, this emphasis on being evidence-based. Well, if things were not evidence-based, and very often they were not and still are not, what are they doing? So what's been happening, I'll quote again here from Wikipedia, that areas of professional practice such as medicine, psychology, psychiatry, rehabilitation, and so forth have had periods in their past where, and I've got this highlighted in yellow, practice was based on loose bodies of knowledge. Some of the knowledge was lore that drew upon the experiences of generations of practitioners, and much of it had no valid scientific evidence on which to justify practices. So, in the college, they teach the research, the evidence for things, but when people go into practice, what are they doing? Using loose bodies of knowledge. Interestingly, doesn't it sound kind of similar to astrology? Loose bodies of knowledge. In astrology, we have all of these different ideas, different traditions, Hellenistic, medieval, Vedic, modern psychological, harmonic, cosmobiology, all these different approaches, people having bits and pieces of different ideas in astrology, some expertise in different areas, sometimes rather loose, and much of the ideas based on lore that drew upon the experience of generations of practitioners. It's this is interesting. They're describing medicine. These same views could be, describing astrologers. So I think we're not so different from what's going on in other practices. So, uh, in this bottom paragraph here on this slide, would a transition to the evidence-based approach be helpful for astrology? So medicine made this transition from loose bodies of knowledge and lore based upon the experiences of generations of practitioners. This is what we do in astrology. We learn the lore, we learn the history, we learn the ideas, we get a loose body of knowledge, we apply it. Do we want to make the same transition that medicine is making? This is a big question. And before we jump to any conclusions, let's learn a little bit more about this whole evidence-based developments in medicine and other fields, the EBP, evidence-based practices. Let's see what's happened in the other fields, see if it's relevant to what goes on in astrology, see if we want to transition to a more evidence-based astrology. Okay, so in medicine, in psychology, people have been using these loose bodies of knowledge, this lore handed down. Why? Why were they doing it? What is the motivation that inclines doctors to use loose bodies of knowledge and lore that drew upon the experiences of generations and practitioners? Why? What's the motivation? Well, I think we can come up with some ideas that are fairly evident. First of all, lack of education. Two, lack of curiosity about alternatives. So you go to the doctor, maybe the doctor takes takes out the stethoscope, checks this, tells you to cough, etc. They go through these procedures. Why are they doing that? Is there real research to support this? What are they getting out of it? Well, maybe they haven't learned about the alternatives. Maybe they're not even curious enough. They just go to work. They do what they've been doing. They maybe they have a lack of motivation to do the very best for their client. They're not curious, inquisitive, motivated, concerned about what they're doing with their client. They just continue to do what they've always done. Also, perhaps they have expertise. They know how to use the stethoscope. They know how to take the pulse. They know how to go through certain procedures. To whatever extent those procedures are valid and useful, they have expertise in it. If the times change and people use other methods, they're going to lose their standing as having the greatest expertise. You could see how these things could be possible in astrology as well. And also, who says that science is going to give us better answers? The doctor has his or her own experiences. They work with clients. They see the results. They have a heritage of information from the previous generations of doctors and medical practitioners. They're in that flow. They're in that heritage. They use it. They speak that language. They have their personal experience. They trust their intuition and personal point of view. So I think that these things could possibly be going on in medicine, psychology, and other areas, and probably to some extent in astrology. One thing that we probably don't have in astrology that happens in medicine, particularly, is the influence of big money in the pharmaceutical industry, where they put their money into the studies and bend the results. So there's a lot of reasons why medicine, psychology, and other areas do not really use an evidence-based approach. And we have many reasons in astrology why we don't. And I think one is that we tend to trust our experience and we speak that language and we have doubts about the value of research coming in and really informing us and helping us. So bottom line is we're not in such a different position in astrology as other professions are. One of the big differences is the other professions profess to be evidence-based. They have colleges and universities that emphasize that. I think in astrology we don't emphasize that as much, but in practice, in reality, there's a lot of similarities. And again, it raises the question of whether we want to also start emphasizing an evidence-based approach in astrology. So another reason why in medicine in particular that the doctors and nurses have not been using evidence-based approaches is the very nature of medicine is that it's really close to impossible to strongly validate many things in medicine. The body is so complex, the variables are so complex. If somebody gets a cold, their immune system, their diet, their lifestyle, their emotions, the of course the bacteria and viruses in the environment, it is so complicated, the genetic components, the power of thought, so many things involved. It's very difficult to determine exactly what the cause is, and because there is not convincing evidence of the best method, it is easy to become lax regarding evidence. So, it can be an argument like this. Well, you can't prove that you're right. You can't prove that vitamin C is going to be good for the cold. You can't prove this. You have your studies. I can question those studies. So in medicine, it's usually very difficult to have convincing evidence. And some people use the word proof. They'll say, can you prove that vitamin C is good for colds? Well, proof is something you do in mathematics. In medicine, psychology, astrology, we generally don't have proofs. What we have is levels of evidence. And since we have levels of evidence, it's very difficult to say whose evidence is stronger than somebody else's. And if you don't have convincing evidence, why shouldn't I trust my own personal experience? My own convictions could be more powerful than whatever state of research we currently have. So these are all good reasons why medicine, psychology, and astrology have not been very strongly evidence-based. Again, the big difference is you would think medicine would be evidence-based based on you might say, the advertising, the philosophy, the concept of how medicine is studied and practiced. But in reality, the Rand Corporation and other studies have demonstrated they don't live up to their philosophy. They are not as evidence-based as they claim to be. But they are becoming more evidence-based because the pressure has been on for decades and increasing to make these professions more evidence-based. Another reason why evidence-based medicine does not gain strength until the late 20th century, and also why astrology would not gain strength, is that the emphasis in research methods until the last 20, 30 years, the emphasis especially in the 30s, 40s, 50s, into the 60s and 70s, has been on statistical research and the gold standard of getting statistical significance. I think everybody's heard about statistical significance, statistical significance, statistical significance over and over. It's like a mantra as a kind of gold standard. And a lot of statistics was based around that, and research was based on the social sciences, complex sciences like medicine, emulating simpler, more mathematically based sciences and trying to emulate that concept to eliminate variables, to define situations, to control one variable, to do these double-blind experiments. That was the thinking, that was the model, that was the concept, that was the world view of research. Now, when you apply those very rigorous, tightly defined, simple experiments, when you try to apply that kind of research to the complex situations of medicine, psychology, and astrology, they tend not to work very well. And the research movement, the research community has changed. It's changed dramatically. Where now, in the 21st century, the emphasis is not so much on getting statistical significance, it's on getting better evidence. So here's a big point I want to make. The whole research community has migrated, it has moved, it has evolved, it has developed, whatever words you want to use for it, from a more narrow, strict emphasis on trying to get perfect experimental results to a more flexible, diverse approach to simply get better evidence. Because that narrow, scientific, very rigorous approach simply has not worked. I'm going to show you some examples and give you the name of at least one major researcher who's been at the forefront of this to open research up to greater diversity and complexity and not always be as rigorous in order to simply make, you might say, incremental improvements. So this relates to astrology. Astrology research is not necessarily about having compelling, convincing evidence. It's often about understanding something just a little bit better, having a little bit more evidence. So because the very rigorous, extremely scientific procedures have not worked in medicine, they don't work in psychology, and in astrology they have not worked, people have gone to less rigorous, more flexible forms of research that help, that make small steps. A small step is better than no step. So it's as if people were taking giant steps. They didn't work, but rather than give up on research altogether, they said, let's take little baby steps. And that's why we call it evidence-based. Evidence-based practice means you're using the results from research, and that research may be just little baby steps, little tiny improvements. Because if you give a medicine to your client, or you give a therapy, and whether you tell them to take vitamin C, or you tell them to take this drug, or you tell them to meditate, or whatever it is you tell them, a little bit more evidence that you're giving the right therapy makes a difference. We want every little bit of improvement that we can get. And that's what's put the emphasis on being evidence-based. You can see how similar this is to astrology, where the rigorous, very narrowly defined statistical studies did not work. But what did they do? Did they say we're going to give up? No, they said let's make our research less rigorous, more flexible, and let's make little steps. And we'll call this evidence-based. Not that it's rigorously scientific, but just evidence-based. And researchers have developed new research methods, new techniques, new ways to make sure we're getting the best evidence, whether it's medicine, psychology, or any other field. So this is a huge movement. This is a very strong emphasis in the professions today because the professions have not been evidence-based. And now there's a big pressure in just about every profession to be more evidence-based. So here's another quote from Wikipedia. In recent years, I put that in that yellow highlight because, again, this stuff is recent. This is what's happening now. So I'm quoting I'm making this video in the summer of 2018, and it's recent years. In recent years, EBP, remember EBP is short for evidence-based practice. EBP has been stressed by professional organizations such as the American Psychological Association, the American Occupational Therapy Association, the American Nurses Association, the American Physical Therapy Association, which have also strongly recommended their members to carry out investigations to provide evidence supporting or rejecting the use of specific interventions. Wow. Think about how that could relate to astrology. Do we want to go down a similar route and put more emphasis? Would our associations, the International Society for Astrological Research, which is one of the groups I'm making this video for, as well as for the viewers of my videos and anybody else, is this a route we want to take? I think there's a lot of skepticism. I think my guess is that most astrologers think, well, I don't know about that. I think we're doing well the way we are. Astrology is really different from other fields. But at least it's interesting. At least it's curious that other fields are not so different from us. They're in a very similar situation where they give therapies, they give interventions, they give counseling, they give advice, they give understanding, whatever it is, service they provide, previously very often based on the heritage of what they've learned and their personal experiences, and now they're becoming more evidence-based. I think it's very parallel, very interesting, and I think we need to take a close look at whether this is relevant to astrology. Now, let me give one example of this new movement in other fields, this new movement of emphasis on being evidence-based. And I'm going to talk about the field of education, and actually it's more than education, it's program evaluation. It's when you want to evaluate an entire program, such as a school system. This has been used by the military. The United States military, military of other countries, have now employed research experts to come in and evaluate their training programs, evaluate their organizational structure. So they bring in scientists, researchers now to evaluate their programs. Are we training? Are we organizing? Are we being effective? And they are using these things and they're getting positive results. Now, a lot of the history, I'll quote from a book called the Cipp. Cipp is CIPP. I'll talk about Cipp on the next few slides a little bit more. But there's an evaluation model called the Cipp Evaluation Model, CIPP Evaluation Model. It was developed by primarily by Daniel Stufflebeam. I think I've got it misspelled there, Stufflebeam, B-E-A-M. There's a book by Stufflebeam and Zhang called the Cipp Evaluation Model. So what this is, it's a model for researchers who go into a school system, the military, a non-profit organization, a for-profit organization, to give advice on how to improve their organization, how to improve the happiness of their employees, their sales, their organization, the education of the children, the training of the soldiers, whatever it is. And they're getting hired, they're getting used, they're being implemented professionally by many groups using these new evaluation models that did not exist in the 1960s. So let's look at the history of this because I think it's relevant to our situation in astrology. To quote from this book, the Cipp Evaluation Model by Stufflebeam and Zhang, the evaluation technology available in the early 1960s was mainly limited to controlled, variable manipulating, randomized, comparative experiments. The outcomes-oriented, objectives-based approach to determining whether behavioral objectives were achieved. So Stufflebeam and Zhang are saying exactly what I said before, that up until the 1960s, when somebody said, come in and evaluate our school, evaluate our elementary school, our middle school, our secondary school, come in and evaluate what's going on here in terms of education and other criteria. You called in a researcher, that researcher is going to be bringing in their controlled variable manipulating randomized comparative experiments approach to understanding. So in the United States, President Lyndon Johnson had a war on poverty, and he required that the schools be evaluated. And so researchers came in and they used their methods. Guess what happened? They didn't work very well. They were not able to tell what schools will be better by using variable manipulating randomized comparative experiments, these very rigorous scientific approaches. Why? Because education is too complex. The variables are too fluid. Life is life is life. It doesn't fit in laboratory very nicely. And this is one of the criticisms astrologers have had of scientific research. But guess what? Scientific research is no longer doing that. It has changed, especially in the 80s and 90s. So in the 60s, that's what science was, even in the social sciences. And here, to quote from Stufflebeam and Zhang, this is page 7 of their book: experimental designs didn't work in the dynamic world of war on poverty projects. Quote unquote. That states it very clearly. You, they went in, Daniel Stufflebeam, an expert professor in research methods, came in with the methods used, and they were not able to come up with useful evaluations. They would say they would try to do the experiments, they would try to come up with a result, they would try to implement them. The schools were no better, the results were not working. So Stufflebeam's attempts to use the evaluation methods of the time failed, and he developed the Cipp method of evaluation. Cipp means context, input, process, product. It's not the only method of evaluation. There are others, but they all are similar in that they are more flexible, they're more fluid, and they're not limited to the old style tool set that was available up until about the 60s and 70s. So other researchers have developed other similar methods. Rigorous statistical sampling and research methods now play a small role in program evaluation. So we still have those very rigorous, well-defined experimental methods, and they are used within the context of something like Cipp. Sometimes they're needed, sometimes they're not needed, but they'll either play no role or a small role in program evaluation. There may be specific programs where they become useful. They're just one tool in the tool set. That's not the whole toolbox as it was back in the 1960s. So other methods are relied on, and they provide more helpful and useful information about what methods work best. So we are now able to evaluate school systems and other training programs using these new research methods. So researchers have developed a whole new set of tools that's very relevant to the predicament we're in astrology, that we're having difficulty evaluating what methods work, so we just trust the personal experience of people. What we are experiencing is not new. Just about every profession in the social sciences and medicine has experienced the same thing. Just very, very interesting. So we have, as I have my title on this slide, new research methods for a complex world. So whether the field is medicine, psychology, education, or whether we are trying to determine a way to treat physical, mental, or emotional problems, evaluate a school, a military program, or any other complex behavior, researchers now use a variety of new research methods that do not provide convincing evidence of what is best, but they provide the best possible evidence of what is most accurate, useful, and effective. So you see the change in the philosophy of research. No longer emphasizing that you're going to get compelling evidence, or what people sometimes erroneously call proof. We're not going to try to prove anything. We're just going to try to make our medicine, our psychology, our schools a little bit better by getting, and I've got it here in yellow highlight, the best possible evidence. That's the mantra now, the best possible evidence. So in astrology, we often think of research as being statistical in nature. It's no longer primarily statistical in nature. We could start thinking about ways to determine what methods have the strongest evidence that they work. This is evidence-based astrology. So I'm 28, almost 29 minutes into this presentation, and I hope that at this point you can feel it, what I'm getting at. And evidence-based astrology means a determination, a really strong effort, you might say a commitment to find out the strongest evidence, even a little bit of evidence that helps us really understand and use tools beyond just our personal experience, or you might say shouting matches, or whoever has the best ability to argue a point, to see what kind of evidence can we get and what kind of research methods there are. And people are developing new ways of getting slightly better understanding of what could really work. This is evidence-based astrology. The commitment, the determination, the understanding, and the frame of reference that you see the world in terms of levels of evidence and having a kind of humility where you're going to respect, appreciate, and incorporate what can be found from these research methods that can help us understand a little bit better the evidence for a particular idea in our field. So, evidence is a continuum. This is a quote from a Wikipedia article also. I'm quoting from different people. They're saying the same thing I'm saying, so you just can hear it stated in different ways from different sources. Research evidence does not fall simply into evidence-based and non-evidence-based classes, but can be anywhere on a continuum from one to the other, depending on factors such as the way the study was designed and carried out. The existence of this continuum makes it necessary to think in terms of levels of evidence, or categories of stronger or weaker evidence that a treatment is effective. Well, I'm just quoting what I just said. Levels of evidence is the emphasis today. And again, this is a huge movement, very powerful movement, where the associations of professional organizations in all of these major fields are now very strongly committed to being evidence-based. Should we do a similar thing in astrology? Now, here's one of the clinching things about EBP, evidence-based practices. They work. They're getting better results. This is this is the clincher. This is it. It's working. So, to quote again from an article, one of the main reasons that EBPs have been so successfully incorporated into treatment services is and I have this again in yellow highlight, the vast amount of studies linking clients' improved health outcomes and the general attitude that treatments should be based in scientific evidence. So people want it, it's a general attitude, and it's working. Vast amount of studies linking clients' improved health outcomes to an evidence-based approach. Medicine is getting better. And so here's some quotes. And other professions are getting better and getting better treatments. And in medicine now they often use meditation, alternative techniques are not completely ruled out. Why? One reason is they're now committed to being evidence-based. So if those methods work, they have now made a commitment to use whatever works. And it is now assumed that professionals must be well informed and up to date with the newest knowledge in order to best serve their clients and remain professionally relevant. That's huge. So there's requirements in most professions to get continued education and training and to find out what the latest new evidence is. There is a really strong movement to make professions evidence-based. Do they always get there? Do they always live up to it? Well, I think big money is still having a huge control in the medical field, but the fact that some professions are failing in some ways does not mean that the vision, the concept, is bad. It just means that it needs to be fully implemented. It works. Would it work in astrology? That's a big controversial question that I'm raising. And there are increasing demands for the whole range of social policy and other decisions and programs run by government and non-governmental organizations, sectors, to be based on sound evidence as to their effectiveness. So this is a huge movement. It's getting put into legal language in rules, regulations, laws, that whatever area of social policy and decisions needs to be evidence-based. So, and a wide range of evaluation approaches. So a wide range. There's many kinds of research methods, techniques, tools, tricks for how to get a little bit better or a much better evidence-based approach to really know what's going to work a little bit better than what we're doing now. So what would an evidence-based astrology be like? And would it be better than what we have now? What are the pros and cons to an evidence-based astrology? Well, first, let me review a simple definition of EBP, evidence-based practice. I'll quote again. Evidence-based practice is an approach that tries to specify the way in which professionals or other decision makers should make decisions by identifying such evidence that there may be for a practice and rating it according to how scientifically sound it may be. Its goal is to eliminate unsound or excessively risky practices in favor of those that have better outcomes. And that states it very well. I mean, just as a way to encapsulate and articulate exactly what we're talking about. We want to get the practices that have the highest likelihood of getting good outcomes. Is there a way to identify what those are so that the professionals can use the best techniques? Now, here are some of the ideas that had to become part of evidence-based practices. By the way, I've got a typo up there. EVP should be EBP. Sorry about that. EBP, evidence-based approaches, evidence-based practices. So one thing, and sometimes these research tools are also, you might say, psychological. They're about attitudes, they're about approaches. It's not all about numbers and specific technical techniques. There are specific technical techniques, but there's also attitudes and approaches. And one of the things that's emphasized in EBP is a questioning approach to practice. A questioning approach. So this is an attitude, a psychological feature is that professionals should have a questioning approach. They should doubt. They should question. Question, why am I taking this client's temperature? It might intuitively feel like a good thing to do, but what's the evidence? What are the results? What does the research say? Is a 100 temperature, something to worry about? 101, 102. Exactly what is it? Question, doubt everything, question everything. So this is one of the key philosophies, key attitudes to developing evidence-based practices is that we question, we doubt, we don't become so sure of ourselves just because it works for us, especially when our colleagues are doing something different. So there's some humility involved, and the ability to question and doubt and to entertain the strong beliefs of your colleagues and to have dialogue about it and sort through these things. So applying this to astrology, we would identify interpretations and predictions that are not accurate, determine what might explain the inaccuracy. Frankly, sometimes I talk to astrologers and every chart they look at they understand. They never seem to ever see an astrology chart they can't make sense of. If I show them a chart of somebody with a stellium in Sagittarius and they don't travel and they're not philosophical, then they have some reason for it. But the reasons are not always convincing or applied in a consistent way. So we need to be humble, open, and we need to make mistakes. If you're not making mistakes, if you're not getting inaccuracy in some of your charts, you're probably fooling yourself. So we need to identify things that are not working when we predicted something or we expected something and it was not quite right. Those are primary candidates for improving. Sometimes if an astrologer says, well, I don't understand this chart, everybody else jumps on board and says, well, let me explain it to you, as if they're dummies. Well, actually, the astrologer who's saying, I don't understand this chart, may not be a dummy. They may be pointing to the future of astrology. The future of astrology where we can admit that sometimes the rules don't work. And it's those cases that don't work where we often get the greatest advancement. So the bottom paragraph I say, do not be so certain of an astrological system or paradigm that we do not consider others. Do not cling to our ideas primarily because of theory when there isn't clear support from observations. So an attitude that's needed to develop an evidence-based astrology. I think this would help our field. I think it would move us forward, and I think a lot of us already do this, and we all do it to some extent. It's something we can be aware of. So here I have in this slide, I just emphasize what I just said, that when we analyze someone's chart, we look for weak spots in the interpretation. We inquire into details to see if our theories are correct. So evidence-based practices are not all about statistics and technical techniques, as I said before. It's an attitude, it's an approach. So does the person with a stellium of planets and the ruling planet is also in that stellium in a particular sign really fit what we expect? I'm a standard case of this. I have a huge stellium in Taurus. I do not fit what most of the books say about huge stelliums in Taurus. Most of it's just not true. Why? And if we're going to use a rule, let's apply it consistently. So too often we accept an interpretation based on some particular traits, but not being really grounding and practical about what we're really saying. So if a person has a lot of earth in their chart, in what way is the person practical and grounded? What is the earth actually doing? So critically analyzing, thinking about what we're saying, how we're saying it. Are we saying consistent things across different charts? Maybe not, but then we identify what the range of possibilities are. So critically thinking and analyzing and being open and welcoming new ideas and admitting when things are not working. This is the attitude that helps with evidence-based practices. The other huge, enormous thing is exploratory research. Exploratory research is a blessing for astrology, in my opinion. What we do in exploratory research is we don't go into the database to confirm that our specific idea is exactly right. We explore the possibilities. Let me give an example. Suppose that I think Mercury in the ninth house inclines a person to be philosophical, broad-minded, perhaps travel. And I think Mercury in Sagittarius does a similar thing, and I think that Mercury aspecting Jupiter does a similar thing. They're all a little bit different, but they all incline a person to think on a large scale. Well, here's what we can do. Rather than just teach our students to believe in it, to tell our clients when we see Mercury in the ninth house or Mercury in Sagittarius or Mercury aspecting Jupiter that they're going to think on a large level, why don't we look at the data? Why don't we see if it's true? So we have software today that has thousands and thousands of charts and research features. That software is available today, right now. People have been using it for over 10 years. It's available. The database is getting bigger, larger, better all the time. We can do it. People are doing it. Why are we not basing our lectures at conferences on these kind of things? Because we haven't transitioned to an evidence-based astrology. Should we transition to an evidence-based astrology? Well, I think clearly we should, at least to the extent that you can go through the database and you can give points for, say 10 points for Mercury in Sagittarius, 10 points for Mercury in the ninth house, using whatever house system you prefer. You can give points to Mercury square Jupiter or Mercury trine Jupiter with whatever orbs you want, with whatever emphasis you want. Find the person who has the highest score. The software will do this for you, and then you read their biographies, read their information, and see if you can make an argument about it. This is a small but important step to seeing if what we're saying is really true. It's a breakthrough. It transitions us to be a modern field, an evidence-based field. And I think it's exciting to find out. It's wonderful to find out, rather than only our own personal experience. So this is the evidence-based approach: questioning, verifying, using the information tools we have to investigate, to explore. And those people who have something very strong are very, very, very important. And this is what we call extreme case sampling. So in the example I just gave of somebody who has Mercury in the ninth house, and it's in Sagittarius, and Mercury's aspecting Jupiter with a very small orb, that person has so much emphasis based on our way of thinking. If you have other ideas like the ruler of Mercury, whatever you want to do is in also aspecting Mercury, you can add those rules in, whatever you want, and see what those people are like, who are strongest. There are technical statistical reasons I won't go into here, but I've written articles about it on why this works so well, that these extreme cases give us huge amounts of information. We do not need control groups. We do not need elaborate studies to make what we call incremental improvements, to improve our astrology, to be evidence-based. These are the kinds of things we can do, and I think we should do. I think it's exciting, it's fun. We really see how it works. Very often you find out that the tone, the exact quality, our ideas are usually on target, or very often on target, but we get a little more subtle insight, a little refinement in our understanding. We have an evidence-based approach. Now here I mention an article that gives technical reasons for why this works. Let's see, I didn't bring up my browser. Let me see if I can bring this up real quickly and show this to you. Okay, I'm bringing up a browser here. This will just take a second. Okay, so here's a browser And if I go to astrosoftware.com, which I'm at here, and I go to articles and videos right here, and I click on articles, and you go down to the 35th article, 35, the value of case studies in astrology. This describes some of the importance of case studies. There's another research article in here on the benefits of extreme case sampling. That's actually not the most important one. Let me search here for this article. If I search for sampling, there it is. 44, extreme case sampling, a powerful research method. Okay, so number 44, you click on that, and if you are interested in the technical details regarding why these things work, here's a detailed article that you can read that goes into some of the more technical reasons. What I want you to really know about here is that there's been a lot of work to figure out techniques, methods, tools, tricks to improve evidence. You don't need to get into the technical details. You need to just use these information tools, these tricks, these and changes in attitude and perspective to be open, receptive, critical, to be aware, to look at cases where our ideas don't work. All of these things help us improve our astrology. So I think evidence-based astrology is the way of the future. Are we looking at a revolution in astrology, a 21st century revolution in astrology? Because never before in the history of astrology have we had the ability to explore what is in the charts of thousands of charts. I'm sorry. Maybe I'm getting too excited here. Let me say that again. Never before in the history of astrology have we had the ability to explore what is in the charts of thousands of people and explore and discover so quickly and easily. It's never been possible. So we can do these things now. We understand the importance of it now. There's a whole momentum in the professions to move away from very narrow, myopic scientific studies to be flexible, to make improvements, because we live in a complex world. Astrology is very complex, but there are tools, there are techniques that make us evidence-based. Okay, so we can move astrology from being based almost exclusively on ideas passed down and that we test anecdotally and in our own experience to also using these evidence-based methods. And I think that evidence-based astrology is the future of astrology. It does not change anything that we're doing in terms of looking at the charts of our clients and friends and family. It means that in addition to that, we use these tools to verify, to confirm, to refine our understanding. I think that's my last slide. Yes, it is. The bottom line is this. People get physically ill. They have emotional problems. They have mental problems. So we have medicine. We have psychology. And for us, we have astrology. There is no completely compelling method to solve people's problems. So we have all of these tools, psychological tools, medical tools, astrological tools, and people can debate and argue from kingdom come what will work and what is useful. What's going to count in the end is looking at it very carefully, opening up to the 21st century information age, and using all of this to refine and improve what we're doing. And the last thing I want to say is that I found that using these information tools, this evidence-based approach, does not in any way work against our intuition, our sensitivity. Some astrologers are psychic astrologers. Any psychic ability you have, it in no way conflicts with that. In fact, it enhances it because it gives you the sensitivity to see, to figure out, to determine what is going on in those cases. So if we look at the people who have Mercury in the 9th house and Sagittarius aspected to Jupiter, that sensitivity, that intuition to figure out what it is that they have in common and how it relates to our previous ideas is a human insight. This is not statistical. What we're doing is we're removing a lot of the problems that weaken our evidence, the selectivity of the people we're studying, that we're not studying the extreme cases. We're using tools and tricks to refine and improve our understanding, and it makes us more evidence based. And even when the improvements seem slight, they are huge. The difference between looking at the charts of the people who have the most ninth house Sagittarius Mercury Jupiter aspects and just saying it based on the few cases we pull out is the difference between night and day. It's the difference between being an anecdotal field based just on anecdotal evidence, and being an evidence-based astrology. So EBA, evidence-based astrology, I think is the way of the future. I think it doesn't matter what kind of astrology you do, whether it's Vedic or Hellenistic or anything else. Evidence-based astrology is the way of the future. It works. It's exciting. I've been doing it for a long time. I cannot imagine any other way. The breakthroughs in understanding are incredible. So it's what I said before that they found out about evidence-based medicine and other evidence-based practices. Two big things. Number one, it works. You get better results. And number two, it's what the public wants. This is what they respect and appreciate. So I think it's a no-brainer. I think we're headed to evidence-based astrology. But, everybody's got a different point of view, and this is just my point of view on it. Okay, my friends, thank you very much for listening. God bless. Namaste.